So, after much conflict, we finally arrive in Fort Frolic, the entertainment district for Rapture. It's where the citizens come to watch theater, to gamble, and purchase things they don't need. It's all about excess and exuberance. To that end, it's currently run by Sander Cohen, a man who was Ryan's friend before the city was even founded and continued to be a confidant until its destruction. He helped create propaganda supporting Rapture and converted a number of other artists to the cause. Just like all the others in Rapture, though, he descended into madness. While he originally had a number of disciples, he grew distrustful of them and insisted they had all betrayed him and needed to be killed for their impertinence. So he bided his time in Fort Frolic until the opportunity arose and Jack tried to pass by. Swooping in, Cohen overtakes the radio and begins talking directly to him, asking for some assistance in exchange for passage. With no other choice, the player heads into the underbelly. First, they have to fight off half a dozen spider splicers to prove themselves. There are a number of electric traps that seemingly appear out of thin air and can be used to assist with the combat. This is a common theme throughout the level, with traps, statues, and enemies appearing and disappearing the second the player blinks. That, combined with the environment, harkens back to the first few areas of the game. While there are less specifically scripted moments, there are still a few, including a room filled with plaster mannequins that are somewhat more alive than they appear. The horror here comes from the disquieting nature of the characters. Sander Cohen is this huge presence, his voice booming, and everything you do is under his command, but you don't see him until the finale, inviting comparisons to films like Tourist Trap and Waxworks, with the threat of being murdered and turned into an art piece via freezing or plaster. There are jump scares as well, and a creeping sense of dread in many of the shops, where it seems there could be enemies around any corner. After exploring the hub of the level, the player is able to head into a theater and find one of Cohen's disciples, Kyle Fitzpatrick. In the prequel novel, it's described how Cohen acquired such a devoted following and how they were lovers at various times. So they not only headed to Rapture for the claim of total artistic freedom, but also to avoid persecution. While not mentioned in the game itself, it's clear that a number of residents left the surface world to avoid prejudice, be it of race, gender, sexuality, or religion. Fitzpatrick is forced to play one of Cohen's scherzos endlessly, while a cartoon-like amount of explosives are attached to the piano, daring him to make a mistake. After some time, he refuses, and Cohen teaches him a lesson. Then, he asks Jack to take a picture of his surprisingly intact body, for that is how he wants to complete his Quidditch, his masterpiece. After returning the photograph, the player is given a reward, as well as a list of names. Though the quest objective leads the player to each in turn, the next few victims can actually be done in any order. First, in the intended order, is Martin Finnegan, the Iceman. The player heads to Poseidon Plaza and finds a frozen tunnel. After entering, they're frozen solid. After some taunting by Finnegan, they regain control, and a collection of icy splicers are flanking them. One, however, is the Iceman, a modified Houdini splicer who fires ice rather than fire, and has the adjusted weaknesses. After killing him and taking a photograph, the player can continue further, or return and claim their reward. Interestingly enough, this character is actually voiced by Ken Levine, the only one in the game. The next target can be found in Rapture Records, though he flees after a small trap and ambush. He's a nitro splicer, but with a slightly expanded health pool. If the player returns both pictures to Cohen's masterpiece, he becomes quite irate, insisting that Jack is a doubter and one of the many critics. He sends an army of splicers after him. All the while, a spotlight makes the action take center stage. After killing the last of them, Cohen apologizes for the outburst and offers thanks in the forms of money and ammunition. The player then heads to Eve's garden to find the final piece of the puzzle. Here the player is finally given some information about their past, finding several ghosts representing Ryan's favorite girl. In the back room, a struggle is heard, and the door reveals a corpse on the bed. While everything doesn't quite add together yet, it's described in audio diaries how Ryan had an affair and the embryo was sold. After leaving, they confront Hector Rodriguez, the last disciple. After being attacked by the player, he flees, and if allowed, leads them on a merry chase around the entire level, before finally arriving back at the garden and fighting. That done, and the photo taken, the player can return to the Quidditch, completing it. Then, Sander Cohen descends the stairs, and in effect they made one developer so happy he did the very same motion in an empty office late at night, after finally getting it right. Here, the player is given a gift and an option. They can either attack Cohen, prompting a fight with not only him but a fairly large-sized group of splicers, or they can move on. Attacking the paintings in any way also triggers this fight. Whatever the player chooses, they then get back in contact with Atlas and can head to Hephaestus. There are a few reasons why Fort Frolic is considered one of the best areas in Bioshock. A large part is Sander Cohen, the constant voice of the area. Both the character and the voice actor contribute to this by offering an arc villain who both rewards you and punishes you as he sees fit. The mad artist is a common trope, but Cohen is particularly well executed example of it. His influence spread over the entire area, with the vaudevillian villains, exaggerated environments, and audio diaries that offer a different take on the fall of Rapture. There is also a good amount of freedom. As stated before, the player can tackle the victims in any order, and explore the periphery areas the same. While it's not a huge area, there is a good amount of secrets and a few solid scares. Why it stands out the most, though, is the areas before and after. Unlike Arcadia or Hephaestus, it feels handcrafted, and breaks up the monotony in narration and the overall story as well. Instead of just going to kill Ryan, the player is now going to kill the proteges. Still killing, but with options and different stakes. Hephaestus is the beating heart of Rapture, the metallic core at the center. After a small initial exploration, the player finds the door to Andrew Ryan's office. Outside are corpses of the many who tried to reach him before, strung up like Christians on the cross. There's a single switch between the player and their ultimate goal. Of course, it's not that easy, as after trying to turn it on, the whole thing shuts down, and splicers erupt out of every door to ambush the player. Next, they're led to the central hub, where a dull orange glow coats everything. There are a few optional areas to explore here, but the key is a small office, hidden away in the depth. An audio diary found tells the plans to blow up the defenses, the only way to get in. To do it, the player has to find the parts of a bomb. The first is easy, nitroglycerin, stored carefully in the administrator's office. The next is a couple of coolant tanks. There are a dozen or so throughout the level. The final, however, R34 wire clusters, are only found in the corpses of Big Daddies. This is the first time a player is really forced to fight them, although there are 2 corpses readily available. After all the components are gathered up, the player grabs the bomb and stuffs it, well, somewhere, and heads to the core to blow up their defenses. This process is easier said than done, as after setting it up they have to defend against a wave of splicers while magically turning a large wheel. With that done, the EMP goes off, and they are fully able to find the bastard Andrew Ryan and to kill him. Then, the twist. The player ascends to Andrew Ryan's office, prepared for an epic confrontation. The previous bosses had simply been normal splicers, but with more health, so that's the expectation. A standard video game boss, and what everything has been building up to. Upon arrival, the player is greeted by Ryan, telling him how disappointed he is. Then red lights start flashing, and it seems that he's trying to take the city down with him. There are machines here to stock up on ammo before the final confrontation, and then the player escapes into the vents. They drop down and find the words, "Would you kindly?" sprawled across a tapestry of madness. These words don't mean much to the player now, though a few audio diaries provide hints about what is about to go down. Another hallway, and the player finally finds themselves in Ryan's domain, in his home. They don't find a man cowering or preparing to fight, but Andrew Ryan standing tall and practicing his putting. He casually reveals that almost everything the player has been told directly has been a lie. There was no happy family, nor a farm. The player, Jack, was a science experiment, a mutant born of plasmids and a prostitute, Ryan's seed, but not his son. Jack has only been alive for 4 years, and his entire existence was to be Frank Fontaine's ace in the hole. Throughout the game, it's been the player's mission to kill Andrew Ryan. There are many reasonable reasons for this. He had created Rapture, and then destroyed it because of greed. He'd strung people up on crosses, murdered women and children, although the ones the player saw before were actually imaginary. He killed one of the few friendly NPCs in the game because she tried to help Jack. Overall, he was not a good person, but it turned out all of those reasons didn't even matter. Jack never had a choice in what he was going to do, and his entire life was dictated by 3 simple words. Would you kindly? Just like that, everything the player has done is recontextualized. They weren't actually in control of their actions. They were simply following the orders of Atlas as if they were mind-controlled, as if they were Jack. Gasp. Put your seatbacks in the upright position. But here, we have to take a brief detour and talk about Saw. Saw was a film released in 2004 and is now a 9-part franchise. It was directed by James Wan and written by Lee Wanell. There will be spoilers for an 18-year-old film, so viewers beware. The basic premise is 2 men are stuck in a bathroom, chained to pipes. In the center of the room is a man, dead, blood strewn all about. They have to figure out how to get out using the clues around them, eventually uncover keys, but not for the chains and rusty saws. So you see the name comes from the implement used in the film. There's a serial killer on the loose, and police investigating him. Throughout much of the film, we're to believe that a man holding family hostage is this murderer. His name is Zepp, and through numerous twists and turns, it's revealed that he's not the killer, and just another player in the game. This is a good twist, and there are several hints foreshadowing it, and it adds to the story, building on the mystery of who the real Jigsaw is. After this revelation, the corpse at the center of the room gets up, and reveals himself to be the real killer. He then tells the one remaining survivor, "Game over," and slams the door. The movie ends, and everyone's excited. No one saw it coming. It's the talk of the town, and it makes $100 million on a $1 million budget. But this second twist, it doesn't make any goddamn sense. There's an explanation in a later film about how he managed to lie, apparently lifeless, on the ground for hours. It was via a sedative, but that's not the main issue. It was stated before that Jigsaw likes to observe his games, and he'd watched others through video cameras or two-way mirrors. The issue is why he would do it in the first place. It's one of the worst places to observe from, and prevents him from interacting in any meaningful way. Ultimately, he's just a prop in the scene, and not the mastermind he believes himself to be. The twist works well, as long as you don't think about it. The Saw sequels all have twists, too, and while some of them are incredibly stupid, including a fourth hidden apprentice, they all make sense, at least on a base level. The original, despite being the best movie by far, fails this bar. Coming back to Bioshock, the twist works on the first level. The player character has been fooled. They believe themselves to be in control, but they were just a puppet without strings. Where it doesn't work, however, is on a meta level. Developers were trying to make commentary about the nature of games, how the player is just blindly following objectives to go from one goal to the next. In an open game, where a player can choose to go one way or another, that might work. But Bioshock is ultimately a linear corridor shooter. The only options the player has, in regard to progression, are to play the game or stop playing the game. They weren't tricked by Atlas, they decided they want to continue playing. That's in addition to the lies by omission in the form of the opening cutscene. The player picked up the radio because they could literally not progress without it. The bathysphere wouldn't open. They grabbed the wrench because, again, it was that or stop playing. The player wasn't tricked into these things, they were simply the only way forward. There was meant to be a big revelation about the player not being in control of their actions, that they were just following orders, the same as the character, but it just doesn't work. Luckily, the scene doesn't rely on it. While it is a significant flaw, a large gash of an open wound, the body is still intact. As there really are 4 twists, one after another. The first, the mind control for Jack, works. It's built up in a few audio logs throughout the game, and it makes sense. The meta twist doesn't work. But then, Andrew Ryan, in complete control of his would-be assassin, demands that Jack kill him with a golf club, and so his head is bashed, with a putter left in like a grotesque antenna. The big question is why he would do this. His final words echo, "A man chooses, a slave obeys." That line defines his philosophy, where total control is the only thing that matters. Ryan believed in the great chain, the connection between each person via the industry that binds them. Someone has to eat, so they are bound to the farmers, but they in turn are bound to those who make their tools, who are bound to the miners. There's a connection between all, but in his belief, it only works if everyone is striving for their own gain. It comes back to objectivism. That not only is selfishness a virtue, it is morally correct, and the only way to progress as a society. With that in mind, we take a look at why Ryan chose to end his life here. One part of it is certainly that Rapture, his city, is already dead. It's been dead for some time, but there's still many desperately clinging to it. As early as the first area, with Dr. Steinman still working on medical perfection, Old Peachy defending his frozen waste to the death, or Sander Cohen always trying to make a new masterpiece. On some level, Ryan knows that all this is his doing, despite all the bluster. He has committed every sin he rallied against in creating the supposed utopia. In his fancy PowerPoint presentation, he decries the governments for taking the sweat of a man's brow. But not only did he exploit the workers who created his city, he taxed the very oxygen they breathed. He believed in the power of industry, but when Fontaine's grew too large, he took it over. He demands freedom of speech and expression, but when dissidents took to the streets, gatherings were banned, and his biggest critic was killed. Every single thing he rallied against, he would end up committing twice over. He was a man defined by contradictions and hypocrisy. Eventually that kind of thing gets to a man, and it's heard throughout the various audio diaries. While there's only a single one where he puts these doubts into words, expressing questions over whether he made mistakes, whether his city is collapsing all due to his own ego, it is clear in many others there is something fundamentally wrong with him. that he's been consumed with his fear of the parasites, a group that ends up containing every person that is not him. The Big Daddies disgust him, and the fact that people openly despise him only builds up that insecurity, and while he puts up a front, in the end he's terrified. There is one other explanation for why he asks Jack to kill him. Jack, despite everything, is his flesh and blood, his child, artificially aged and transformed, but still his, and in the end, with nothing else in the way, he can't bring himself to kill him. Andrew Ryan's aunt and uncle were killed, as he did not have enough money for a bribe, and it's easy to see how that shaped him. Even in his final breath, he still taunts Jack, and by extension, Atlas, telling him that a man chooses, a slave obeys. There's something to be said about how the primary gameplay design was to allow for player choice, with hacking having 4 options to deal with it, and the wide variety of weapons and plasmids, as well as upgrades, and the miscellaneous objectives that can be completed in any order. Back to the initial game design document, the statement was always choice. And then the story came, and was made to be about how the main character has no choice, that they've been made a slave to other ambitions. The contrast between story and gameplay. Ludo Narrative Dissonance. The term was coined by Clint Hawking to describe Bioshock. In simple terms, it describes the difference between the way a game presents itself in the gameplay and the way it presents the story. Hawking is a game developer and blogger who was working on Far Cry 2 at the time, and then floated around between companies, including LucasArts, Valve, and Amazon, none of whom really make games anymore. There was a period of 12 years where nothing he worked on was released, and that ended with Watch Dogs Legion. Ironically, that game is full of dissonance of its own kind. Now, what he describes is actually different than what many others have described as the problem with the game, at least in terms of its relationship with the player. It's easy to point out how it doesn't make sense that, like an enormous rat, the player's character scurries between trash cans and corpses, devouring all manner of expired food and spirits. This could be called the friend test. If someone else was sitting and watching the player go through the game, they would likely ask, "Why are you eating out a trash can?" And the player would have no answer. There's similar questions: why does a Big Daddy have so much money? Or, why do components suddenly start appearing once crafting unlocks? These are small things, but each could be the breaking point in immersion, which is the whole point of the story, and the twist, and the world. The game design in some respects is stuck in an older arcadey experience which clashes with the narrative they're trying to tell. Big Daddies require the player's resources, so they have to reward them with money to purchase more ammunition and health. From that perspective, it makes total sense. But why does the lumbering beast need money? Or ammunition, at least for the comparatively small arms the player has? There aren't answers to these questions. This brings up the point of player choice. It is arguably the entire focus of combat. How do you want to kill an enemy? An electric bolt followed by a wrench swing? A set of grenades laid one after the other? Or perhaps you'll lure them into a Big Daddy and hypnotize them to do the dirty work for you. All valid and encouraged through certain set pieces, but that's far from the only choice the player has. Throughout the game, the player encounters little sisters and has the option to either save or murder them. Killing them elicits more Atom, the currency to upgrade plasmids, but is the morally reprehensible thing to do. Doing this only once results in the bad ending, where the main character becomes some sort of evil overlord. Though there are technically 2 voices telling the player to do one or the other, the clear choice the designers intended was to save them. In fact, with every 3 the player saves, they're given a gift, taking back most of the Atom they would have gained from killing them, as well as additional bonuses. In this way, it's really a false choice, as a player actually gains more from the good option. Coming back to Hawking's point, the dissonance he discussed is not with the little things, but the overlying theme. The main tenet of this is the player must keep playing the game to progress, in the way that the developers intended. They have to go through the levels, accomplish objectives, and ultimately their fate has been pre-decided. After that, the player is told that a man chooses, a slave obeys. In this case, the main character is a slave, driven by both the commands of another character in the game, as well as the player's literal inputs. But the game is trying to talk directly to the player. That is the aim of the twist, to change everything that has happened and make the player feel like a fool for obeying the instructions. And on that level, it fails. For all its bluster, its build-up, the trick it tries to play on the player, it's nothing more than illusion. But even with this failure, does it matter? Not really. The impact it has on players can be seen in reviews and praise it still receives to this day. Whether all the elements come together perfectly is irrelevant, because it's the emotion that matters, and that is well delivered. Despite all the story elements, there is still that dissonance. There's a reason there was so much disconnect between the story and gameplay. Of course, part of that is the gameplay was always first in design and development, but the other was that Bioshock was far from smooth sailing when it came to its creation. In some ways it mirrored the fall of Rapture itself, where a lot of attention was paid to the people at the top, but those who worked on the foundations fell to the wayside. Everything started out well, with a small team that had all worked with each other on several titles. Tensions began to grow, however, as the numbers ballooned out, increasing by a factor of 10. Though they aimed for a flat structure, with Levine at the top, of course, this resulted in communication problems between departments. The art team felt like they were drifting, as the development team was unable to decide on a vision, leaving them making uninspiring designs for no one. Luckily for the team, a new hire, Hoagie de la Plante and Jean-Paul LeBreton, a level designer who began at the start of development, were able to collaborate together independently and come up with the Tea Garden of Arcadia, an Art Deco park that combines greenery with the undersea aesthetic. Levine took this example and showed it off to the team, saying that was exactly what the next-gen look he was going for was. While this gave the art team something to strive for, it added to tensions as, in some ways it felt more like, look at what these two people made, what have you been doing? The tensions continued and grew as development dragged on. Levine began to shout at others in meetings, dismissing ideas out of hand. There was also a sense of growing paranoia as the team expanded, with Levine having little to no trust in new hires, insisting that he keeps his own vision pure. There was also an inherent tension within the man. Despite video games being so entrenched in nerd culture, especially the cult classic that was System Shock 2, he desired to make something more mainstream, which could be respected by people who didn't play video games. Anything that reminded Ken of the nerdy roots from which Bioshock sprang terrified him. LeBreton. This particular line runs all throughout the game. As though the gameplay is a culmination of arcade shooters, there is nary a reference or hint at the genre's past. Some things, like a guiding arrow and the ability to turn Vita chambers off, were added late in development at the publisher's request, as previously they were thought of as not fitting the vision. Although there were certainly times when this exacting view of the game was a boon, as described when the team was having an issue with a quest in Fort Frolic, and Ken came into the situation without the preconceptions we built up and offered a solution that fit perfectly. Levine's view of himself also changed throughout development. At one point he referred to himself as Cassandra, the mythological Greek princess who was cursed with the knowledge of prophecy, but never to be believed. An interesting view of things, given he was the man at the top, in charge of all decisions. In the final few years of development, the crunch time grew and grew, progressing to a mandatory 6, then 7 days a week, as a direct order from Levine. Of course, recent studies have shown there is no increase, and in some cases decreases, in productivity from additional workdays, but in the games industry, that sort of science doesn't mean anything. The crunch, of course, did little for the team's morale, and it came at the same time as the rifts grew larger within the team. Paul Hellquist, the lead designer, and Ken Levine began to have vocal arguments, and eventually Hellquist was shut out of development meetings entirely. Levine had decided there wasn't enough time to have discussion about things, and his decisions were final. In some ways he was right, and at a certain point in development, there simply isn't a way to implement large changes, and the train simply has to continue on the track. There were certainly better ways to do this. Both 5 years perspective, Hellquist said he was a pain in Ken's ass towards the end of development. I was constantly challenging his opinions and directives, and I expect he was exasperated. Despite accepting it, he believed that a large part of it was that Levine still viewed him as a junior-level designer and not his equal. In truth, there was no one Levine viewed as an equal. For during development, he was Ryan, and that meant he was God. People looked up to him, but people also despised him. It's safe to say it was not an easy position to be in, and it's easy to see how the stress got to him. Bioshock had been his baby for half a decade, and anything that criticized or challenged that was going to be hard to take. Near the end of 2007, the team was given a surprise. They had been given 3 additional months of development. This was a blessing and a curse, as by that point 7-day work weeks had become the norm, and looking at 90 more days of that was near torture. Still, in a dogmatic fashion, the team had begun to convince themselves that this was going to be the game. They needed just a little more time for perfection, as what they were working on meant something. It was a little part Stockholm Syndrome, but some of them could also see how it would be received, that what they were working on was actually pretty good. Of course, there were also those that viewed the game as a disaster, and initial blind playtests confirmed these fears. They viewed the game as too dark, confusing, and Atlas was a lecherous Colonel Sanders. He had a southern drawl at that point. This was in January of 2007, with only 6 months left in development. Huge overhauls were called for, and the game was made brighter, clearer, and Atlas was recast. Because of these decisions, confidence was raised, and as the release loomed, the team was satisfied. Everyone except for Levine, however, who grew increasingly antsy about the credits. Ken is paranoid about others taking credit for what he considers his work, LeBreton said. He chose people's titles very carefully. Due to the collaborative nature of game development, management will be involved with everything, but also have no involvement with individual elements. This terrified Levine, as he viewed himself as the auteur, the genius behind the game. After launch, many members of the team left, exhausted from the conflicts and the long work hours. This is not uncommon, especially in larger studios, but many of the leads left as well, with Levine being the only one still holding the fort. The immediate sequel was then passed off to 2K Martin, coming out a few years later, and the official follow-up would take another 8 years, with its own sort of development hell. But even with all the conflicts, Bioshock released to critical acclaim, scoring 96 on Metacritic, an almost unprecedented result, especially for a first-person shooter. It would leave a lasting legacy as well, on the games industry, as well as its own company. That's all a tale for another day, as well as the myriad of spin-offs, the final act of the game, and what would become of Ken Levine.